All right, well, let's kick off our lecture on modernism and its relationship to the liberal tradition of American Protestantism. And you've read your textbook at this point, the chapter on American Protestantism, specifically focusing on the liberal traditions and kind of the mainline traditions of American Protestant denominations. And Catherine Albanese does a great job of giving you really a thorough historical analysis and background on kind of the historical movement, or sometimes it's called the genealogy, which is kind of tracing the lineage of a movement and going backwards in time, and then kind of seeing how we ended up with these particular traditions in the modern day. And so Albanese does a wonderful job of that, and really provides a helpful overview for you as a student to understand, how did American Protestantism emerge from the colonial period, and how did it evolve through just the different cultural changes through the American Revolution, the antebellum period, the American Civil War, and then that time period during Reconstruction and upwards through the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century with World War One, and then into the period between the two world wars, and then from World War II and moving forward into the modern day. And so, again, if you need to go back and reference it, it's a great resource for you to kind of figure out where you land. But one of the things that I wanted to really touch on was really the foundational change within American Protestantism during the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And so oftentimes this is called the modernist debate or modernist fundamentalist debate. And really, historians of religion and religious studies scholars have really pointed to a few points and a few changes in kind of cultural thought, cultural norms in America that really led to the transformation of American religion, particularly Protestantism. And so what I want to do is really highlight that, because Catherine Albanese in her book, she just touches on it, that there were a couple of things at the end of the 19th century that really made a direct impact on the landscape of American religion. And one of those was Darwin's theory of evolution, that as that came to become very popular and embraced around European circles and American circles of thought, that it really started to question going, okay, so what do we do with the Bible? Because we have to remember, within Protestantism, the Bible is the central source of authority. This idea of, in Latin, it's called sola scriptura. If you trace the history of Protestantism, if you go all the way back to Martin Luther and John Calvin and Zwingli and these different European figures that helped launch and change the face of Christianity in Europe and then subsequently throughout the world with the Protestant Reformation, you see that the Bible became this central, not just a text, but it became the authoritative mouthpiece, that this was literally God's word. This is really how God speaks to his people, and that it is up to pastors and also lay people. That you have to remember that the Protestant Reformation took place around the time that there was a major shift in technology with what? The invention of the printing press. And the invention of the printing press, Gutenberg's printing press in particular, transformed how people engaged and thought about the world around them, because they had information for the first time and they learned to read. And you have to remember, in religious circles, and especially within Christianity and Roman Catholicism, you have to remember who were the ones that had the authority. It was the priests, it was the bishops, it was the Pope. And they were the ones who could read Latin. They were the ones who were educated. And the invention of the printing press changed all of that over time. And so more people could have access to the Bible, they could read the Bible, and they could read it in their own language. And so you see this as it emerges, again, going back to the American discussion of, the Bible becomes the central focal point of Protestant traditions. And of course, that within the Protestant traditions, there were very different ways in which people wanted to practice their Christianity. So when we talk about liberal Protestant traditions, let me just kind of uh, share a little bit about, and identify what some of those traditions are, because you're going to hear me talk about them once in a while. So when we talk about mainline traditions, these are old traditional American denominations within Protestant circles. And so this would be like Episcopalian, this would be Methodist. In particular today, the offshoot of that is United Methodist Church. You have the Presbyterian Church, which today is now the Presbyterian USA, or Presbyterian Church USA. And you have the Congregationalist Church, Universalist Church, Unitarian churches, and even some Baptist denominations, particularly like the American Baptist denomination. These are what they would call mainline Protestant traditions that have a long history here, that are distinguished from evangelical traditions, that they have a very distinct theology and a very distinct way of practicing and understanding the world around them, compared to other, what we would now call evangelical or fundamentalist traditions. And so next week in our lecture and next week in your readings, you're going to learn more about those traditions, and particularly the rise of fundamentalism, the rise of evangelical conservatism, and how they shape the American landscape today. And so, so you have these mainline denominations, and they are the primary force in American religion up through the 19th century. So they are the dominant denominations in terms of size of congregations and adherents. And what we have changed, like going back to what I was saying earlier about theories like Darwin's theory of evolution, because if the Bible is your main source of authority, and it talks about the world being created in 6 days, and there are many different interpretations of what that actually means, depending on the denomination and the theological perspective. Today, there's lots of different ideas about it, but back in the 19th century, there was really only one way to look at it, and it was taken very literally, that the world was created in 6 days and God rested on the seventh. And that's found in the Genesis account. And Charles Darwin's theory of evolution obviously challenges that. It says no, that the world is millions, if not billions of years old. And people had to reckon with that, going, wait, how do you reconcile the two? How do you make sense of the two? Along with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and it's called, if you study it, it's actually a contemporary, or I'm sorry, a predecessor of Charles Darwin was Charles Lyell, and he was the one that invented deep time, and he's really the founder of modern geology. He was the one that kind of invented the idea of, like, hey, look at the sediments, and there seems to be patterns there, and it seems that the world is way older than we thought it would be. So what we have going on in Germany at this time, and then later in other parts of Europe through Great Britain, and then later into American universities, is it's the shift in the way people understood how to study the Bible. And this is called higher criticism. And Catherine Albanese does touch on this. She highlights it and then kind of moves on. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of discuss this as well, because this has a profound impact in the rise of the modernist impulse within early American Protestantism, particularly in these mainline denominations. And so you have these scholars who start treating the Bible scientifically, meaning that they're studying it not from a theological or confessional value, but from a humanistic value, meaning that they look at the Bible as ancient literature that has tremendous impact on the world and has shaped Western civilization, but not necessarily that it's divine. And rather than trying to look at how the text was put together, they start to question, going, wait, if we know that the text maybe had multiple authors, so like let's take the Gospels, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, going, they're anonymous. They don't they don't never actually say who their author is. And we know, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, often known, and they're lumped together, is called the Synoptic Gospels. And if you're interested in that, if you take like the New Testament course here at Victor Valley, you'll learn all about that. And these Synoptic Gospels, these three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they seem to have a lot in common, almost word for word, and yet they also are very different in some of their stories. And even some of the same stories that they're recording are very, very different. And so these scholars, particularly in Germany, were going, well, then we know that these were all edited. We know that these texts were maybe written by multiple people, or they were written and edited over the series, a course and series of time, and that our job as scholars is to understand that phenomenon. And what this does, though, obviously, is that it really starts to begin to undermine the values and the theological beliefs held by people who view the Bible as God's word and authoritative in that sense. And so, you know, we start to see in America a shift within even universities, the big universities like Harvard and Yale and Princeton. These were, you have to remember that these institutions of higher education were designed to train ministers. That's what they were really founded for, and you can trace their lineage back to that. And during this time of the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, 20th century, you see this shift. You see this radical shift where they start to embrace the higher criticism within their theological schools and saying, you know what? You know, in order to keep up with the times, in order to reconcile what we now have as, you know, views on science, and even philosophically, you have to remember there's a big shift going on in terms of how people understand the concept of God and God's role in the world. We see this even with Friedrich Nietzsche and his whole movement. If you read his book called The Gay Science, which that's where he famously states that, you know, God is dead and we have killed him. And these philosophical ideas were starting to weave into the fabric of Western culture and into American culture as well, where people were going, so what is the value of God in this? Who is God? Is God even there? Does it matter? Right? And so these denominations within American Protestantism started to have to think and go, how do we maintain relevancy? How do we maintain identity and shared community when the world is changing? And for many of these mainline Protestant denominations, they started to embrace higher criticism of the Bible. They started to embrace scientific theories such as evolution and go, look, the Bible's an ancient text. It's not a scientific textbook. It tells us a lot of good ideas about how to live and how to care for people and how to maybe follow God through some of these very practical means. But it is definitely not a scientific textbook. So it's not really telling us about how many days the world is created. It's not telling us about, you know, these things like miracles and supernatural phenomenon such as God parting the Red Sea or the miracles of Jesus. When these scholars of higher criticism started studying the life of Jesus, they would actually start to omit some of those things and going, look, it's outside of our scope. We don't know whether Jesus did this or not because we weren't there. So now we're going to study Jesus as a historical figure. And this is where you get the early conversations about the historical Jesus and the study of that. And so all of that coalesces at the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, as these Protestant denominations start to embrace these ideas and going, okay, we need more modern ideas about religion. We need modern ideas about the Bible and about who God is, and they start to embrace this. Well, of course, as groups start to embrace this, there are other groups that start to fragment from this and go, no, we think that these theories are wrong. We think these approaches on how to study the Bible are wrong, that they are dishonoring to our traditions, they're dishonoring to God. And so, you see that what they call the modernist fundamentalist split, where you have um, these these groups fragment off and who form what we would call fundamentalist groups, maintaining their identity through shared belief that the Bible is God's inspired, inerrant word, and that what it says is true, even if we don't fully understand the scientific implications of it. And so you start to see Protestantism really um, fracture here into these camps of more liberal, what we would call liberal, modernist Protestant groups, which is where most of the mainline denominations fell into. And then you also have um, the fundamentalist groups, which is where modern day like evangelicalism starts to emerge out of. And then into the 20th century you also see the rise of like Pentecostalism, and Pentecostalism has roots in America. We'll talk about that in our lecture next week, because it's very close to home here in Victor Valley, because Pentecostalism really emerged in Los Angeles in 1906. And so it's a really fascinating story, and we'll talk about that next week. But for our conversation here, um, I just wanted to lay the groundwork for that, because when we talk about this modernist impulse, the world was changing, and this is goes back to what we have talked about throughout this course, which is how do people connect with the unseen order of the universe through mythic narratives and through rituals. And this is an adaptation of that. This is groups of people within these denominations in America making conscious decisions to embrace the American culture that is changing while still maintaining some sense of religious identity. And so you start to see this all emerge and shift. And it's really, really fascinating, because this persists up into the modern day. So if you um, attend or you study um, denominations today that are mainline, so if you study the modern Episcopalian Church, or the Presbyterian USA Church, or the United Methodist Church and their histories, you can see that they still maintain some of these ideas in how they think about the Bible, how they think about practice, how they think about ordination, of who actually gets to be a leader in the church. And this tends to emerge with LGBTQAI discussions about are they allowed to be clergy or not, people who identify with the LGBTQ camp. And there's all sorts of discussions around that. And that, again, is based off of, and you can trace its lineage back to the modernist impulse and the changes that they embraced at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. So I hope that this gives you a helpful overview of that. And below you're going to see some of the specifics that go along with that. And so take a look and kind of read through just some of the recap that we've discussed